Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of Out of My Life by Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. We present this audiobook in 24 parts. Subscribe to our channel so as not to miss anything. Chapter 7, 1915. 1. The question of a decision.
The achievements of Germany and the German army in the year 1914 will only be appreciated in all their heroic greatness when truth and justice have free play once more. When our enemies' attempt to mislead world opinion by propaganda is unmasked, and when Germany's passion for self-criticism to the point of self-mutilation has made way for a quiet, judicial examination. I have no doubt that all this will come in due course. Yet in spite of all our achievements, the mighty work that had been forced upon us was not crowned with success. Up to this point, our battles had saved us for the time being, but they had not brought us final victory. The first step to such a consummation was a decision on at least one of our fronts. We had to get out of the military, political, and economic ring that had been forged about us, a ring which threatened to squeeze the breath out of our bodies even in a moral sense. The reasons why victory had hitherto escaped us were debatable, and they will remain debatable. The fact remains that our high command believed themselves compelled prematurely to draw away to the east strong forces from the west, where they were trying to secure a rapid decision. Whether an exaggerated idea of the extent of the successes hitherto obtained in the west had a great effect on that decision must remain uncertain. Whatever the cause, the result was half measures. One objective was abandoned, the other was never reached. In many a conversation with officers who had some knowledge of the course of events in the Western Theater in August and September 1914, I have tried to get an unbiased opinion about the transactions which proved so fateful for us in the so-called Battle of the Marne. I do not believe that one single cause can make our great plan of campaign, unquestionably the right one, responsible. A whole series of unfavorable influences was our undoing. To these I must add, 1. The watering down of our fundamental scheme of deploying with a strong right wing. 2. The fact that through mistaken independent action on the part of subordinate commanders, our left wing, which had been made too strong, allowed itself to be firmly held. 3. Ignorance of the danger to be apprehended from the strongly fortified great railway nexus of Paris. 4. Insufficient control of the movements of the armies by the high command. 5. Perhaps also the fact that at the critical moment of the battle, certain subordinate commands were not in close enough touch with a situation not in itself unfavorable. The impartial examination of history and the critics will find here a worthy field for their activities. May I, however, here express a decided opinion that the failure of our first operation in the West brought us into a position of great peril, but in no way made the further prosecution of the war hopeless for us. If I had not been firmly convinced of this, I should have deemed it my duty, even in the autumn of 1914, to make appropriate representations to higher authority, even to my all-highest warlord himself. Our army had displayed qualities so brilliant and so superior to those of all our enemies, that in my opinion, if we had concentrated all our resources, we could have secured a decision, at any rate at the outset, in one of our theaters of war, in spite of the growing numerical superiority of the enemy. West or east? That was the great question, and on the answer to it our fate depended. Of course, main headquarters could not allow me a deciding voice in the solution of this problem. The responsibility for that lay alone and exclusively on their shoulders. I consider, nevertheless, that I have the right and duty to bring forward my views on this subject and express them frankly and openly. From the general point of view, the so-called decision in the West was traditional. I might perhaps say national. In the West was the enemy whose chauvinistic agitation against us had not left us in peace even in times of peace. In the West, too, was now that other enemy who every German was convinced was the motive force working for the destruction of Germany. Compared with that, we often found Russia's greed for Constantinople comprehensible. Her longings for East and West Prussia were not taken seriously. Thus, as regards the war in the West, the German High Command could be certain that the governing minds of the fatherland, and indeed the feelings of the majority of the nation, were on their side. Here was a moral factor not to be despised. I should not like to say whether this played any part in the calculations of our military leaders, but I know for certain that the idea of a decision in the West had been brought before us hundreds and thousands of times, both verbally and in writing. Indeed, when the conduct of operations was entrusted to me subsequently, I found those who suggested the idea of formally sparing Russia. It was commonly believed that it would be relatively easy for us to come to an understanding with Russia by the methods of peace. Even to me, the decisive battle in the West, a battle which would have meant final victory, was the ultima ratio, but an ultima ratio which could only be reached over the body of a Russia stricken to the ground. Should we ever be able to strike Russia to the ground? Fate answered this question in the affirmative, but only 2 years later, when, as was to be made clear, it was too late. For by that time our situation had fundamentally changed. The numbers and resources of our other foes had in the meantime reached giant proportions, and in the circle of their armies, Russia's place had been taken by America, with her youthful energies and mighty economic powers. I believed that in the winter of 1914-15, we could answer the question whether we could overthrow Russia in the affirmative. I believe it just as much today. Of course, our goal was not to be reached in a single great battle, a colossal sedan, but only through a series of such and similar battles. The preliminary conditions for this were present, as had already been revealed, in the generalship of the Russian army commanders, though not of their commander-in-chief. Tannenberg had showed it clearly. Lodz would have shown it, perhaps on an even greater scale, if we had not had to take the battles in Poland against too great a numerical superiority upon our shoulders, and so to speak, stop halfway to victory for lack of numbers. I have never underestimated the Russians. In my opinion, the idea that Russia was nothing but despotism and slavery, unwieldiness, stupidity, and selfishness was quite false. Strong and noble moral qualities were at work there, if only in comparatively restricted circles. Love of country, self-reliance, perseverance, and broad views were not entirely unknown in the Russian army. How otherwise could the huge masses have ever been put in motion, and the nation and troops have been willing to accept such hecatombs of human life? The Russian of 1914 and 1915 was no longer the Russian of Zorndorf, who let himself be slaughtered like sheep. But what the Russian masses lacked were those great human and spiritual qualities which among us are the common property of the nation and the army. The previous battles with the armies of the Tsar had given our officers and men a feeling of unquestioned superiority over the enemy. This conviction, which was shared by the oldest Landsturm man with the youngest recruit, explains the fact that here in the East we could use formations, the fighting value of which would have prevented their employment on the Western Front, except in emergencies. It was an enormous advantage to us that from the point of view of numbers, we were so inferior to our combined enemies. Of course, there were limits to the use of such troops, in view of the demands which had to be made on the endurance and strategic mobility of the units in the Eastern Theater. The main blow had to be delivered, time and time again, by really effective divisions. If the numbers required to carry through some decisive operation could not be obtained by new formations, it was my opinion that they should be obtained from the Western Front, even if it meant evacuating part of the occupied territory. These views are not the result of a process of reasoning after the event or post hoc criticism. It has been urged against them that the Russians were in a position, in case of need, to withdraw so far into the so-called vast spaces of their empire that our strategic impetus must be paralyzed the farther we followed them. I think that these views were inspired far too much by memories of 1812, and that they did not take sufficient account of the development and transformation of the political and economic conditions obtaining at the heart of the Tsar's realms. I am thinking more particularly of the railways. Napoleon's campaign drove but a comparatively small wedge into vast Russia, thinly populated, economically primitive, and, from the point of view of domestic politics, still asleep. What a different thing a great modern offensive would have been. What totally different circumstances would it find now, even in Russia? At bottom, it was these views which were the subject of controversy between main headquarters, as then constituted, and my army headquarters. Public discussion has introduced a good deal of legend into that controversy. There could be no question of dramatic action, however deeply the affair affected me personally. I leave a final expert decision to the critics of the future, and am convinced that even these will not come to any unanimous conclusion. In any case, I shall never live to see it.
2. Battles and operations in the East.
I can only deal in broad outlines with the events of the year 1915 in the East. On our part of the Eastern Front, fighting was resumed with the greatest violence. It had never completely died down. With us, however, it did not rage with quite the same fury as in the Carpathians, where the Austro-Hungarian armies in a desperate struggle had to protect the fields of Hungary from the Russian floods. The critical situation had taken even my chief of staff there for a time. The real reasons which led to our separation at this moment I have never known. I sought them in material considerations and asked my emperor to cancel the order. His Majesty graciously approved. After a short time, General Ludendorff returned, full of grave experiences and holding even graver views of the condition of affairs among the Austro-Slav units. The idea of a decision in the East must have been particularly welcome to the Austro-Hungarian General Staff. It must have recommended itself to them not only on military, but also on political grounds. They could not remain blind to the progressive deterioration of the Austro-Hungarian armies. If the war were dragged out for a long time, the process would apparently make more headway in the armies of the Danube monarchy than in that of their opponents. Further, the Austrians were fearful that the threatened loss of Przemysl would not only increase the tension of the situation on their own front, but that under the impression which the fall of this fortress must make on the nation, the signs, even then quite distinguishable, of the disintegration of the state and loss of confidence in a favorable termination of the war would increase and multiply. Moreover, Austria-Hungary was already feeling herself threatened in the rear by the political attitude of Italy. A great and victorious blow in the East could fundamentally change the unhappy situation of the state. Looking at the situation in that light, I took the side of General Conrad when he suggested to the German High Command a decisive operation in the Eastern Theater. Main headquarters considered that they could not place at my disposal the reinforcements which I considered necessary for such a decision. Of the plans proposed, therefore, only one was allotted to my sphere of command, the great blow which we delivered in East Prussia. At the beginning of the year, 4 army corps were placed at our disposal and transferred from home and the Western Front. They were detrained in East Prussia. Part went to reinforce the 8th Army, and part to form the 10th Army under General von Eichhorn. They deployed and separated with a view to breaking out from both wings of our lightly held entrenched position from Lotzen to Gumbinnen. The 10th Russian Army of General Sievers was to suffer deep envelopment through our 2 strong wings, which were to meet ultimately in the east on Russian soil, and thus annihilate to a great extent everything the enemy had not got away. The fundamental idea of the operation was put into the following words for our army commanders on January 28th, while we were still at Posen. I intend to employ the 10th Army, with its left wing along the line Tilsit-Wilkowiecki, to envelop the enemy's northern wing, to tie him down frontally with the Königsberg Landwehr Division and the left wing of the 8th Army, and employ the right wing of the 8th Army for an attack on the Arras-Johannesburg line and south thereof. On February 5th, precise battle orders were issued from Insterburg, whither we had gone to direct the operations. From the 7th onwards, they set in motion the 2 groups on the wings, a movement recalling in some respects our celebrated Sedan. And it was indeed a Sedan which finally befell the Russian 10th Army in the region of Augustovo. It was there that our mighty drive came to an end on February 21st. And the result was that more than 100,000 Russians were sent to Germany as prisoners. An even larger number of Russians suffered another fate. On the orders of His Majesty, the whole affair was called the Winter Battle in Masuria. I must be excused a more detailed description. What is there new, I could say? The name charms like an icy wind or the stillness of death. As men look back on the course of this battle, they will only stand and ask themselves, have earthly beings really done these things, or is it all but a fable and a phantom? Are not those marches in the winter nights, that camp in the icy snowstorm, and that last phase of the battle in the forest of Augustovo so terrible for the enemy, but the creations of an inspired human fancy? In spite of the great tactical success of the winter battle, we failed to exploit it strategically. We had once more managed practically to destroy one of the Russian armies, but fresh enemy forces had immediately come up to take its place, drawn from other fronts to which they had not been pinned down. In such circumstances, with the resources at our disposal in the east, we could not achieve a decisive result. The superiority of the Russians was too great. The Russian answer to the winter battle was an enveloping attack on our lines on the far side of the old Prussian frontier. Mighty masses rolled up to the enemy commander-in-chief for use against us, overwhelming masses, each one larger than our whole force. But German resolution bore even this load. Russian blood flowed in streams in the murderous encounters north of the Naro and west of the Niemen, which lasted into the spring. Thank God it was on Russian soil. The Tsar may have had many soldiers, but even their number dwindled noticeably as the result of such massed sacrifices. The Russian troops which went to destruction before our lines were missing later on, when the great German and Austro-Hungarian attack farther south made the whole Russian front tremble. At this time, the most violent fighting was in progress not only on the frontiers of Prussia, but in the Carpathians also. It was there that the Russians tried throughout the whole winter at any price to force the frontier walls of Hungary. They knew, and were right, that if the Russian flood could sweep into Magyar lands, it might decide the war and that the Danube Empire would never survive such a blow. Who could doubt that the first Russian cannon shot in the plains of Hungary would echo from the mountains of Upper Italy and the Transylvanian Alps? The Russian Grand Duke knew only too well for what great prize he demanded such frightful sacrifices from the Tsar's armies on the difficult battlefields in the wooded mountains. The fearful and continuous tension of the situation in the Carpathians and its reaction on the political situation imperiously demanded some solution. The German General Staff found one. In the first days of May, they broke through the Russian front in northern Galicia and took the enemy's front on the frontiers of Hungary in flank and rear. My headquarters was at first only an indirect participant in the great operation which began at Gorlice. Our first duty, within the framework of this mighty enterprise, was to tie down strong enemy forces. This was done at first by attacks in the great bend of the Vistula west of Warsaw and on the East Prussian frontier in the direction of Kovno, then on a greater scale by a cavalry sweep into Lithuania and Kurland, which began on April 27th. The advance of 3 cavalry divisions, supported by the same number of infantry divisions, touched Russia's war zone at a sensitive spot. For the first time, the Russians realized that by such an advance, their most important railways, which connected the Russian armies with the heart of the country, could be seriously threatened. They threw in large forces to meet our invasion. The battles on Lithuanian soil dragged out until the summer. We found ourselves compelled to send larger forces there. To retain our hold on the occupied region and keep up our pressure on the enemy in these districts, which had hitherto been untouched by war. Thus a new German army gradually came into existence. It was given the name of the Niemen Army, from the great river of this region. I have no space to deal with the movement of our armies, which began on May 2nd in northern Galicia, and spreading along to our lines, ended in the autumn months east of Vilna. Like an avalanche which apparently takes its rise in small beginnings but gradually carries away everything that stands in its destructive path, this movement began and continued on a scale never seen before, and which will never again be repeated. We were tempted to intervene directly when the thrust past Lemberg had succeeded. The armies of Germany and Austria-Hungary wheeled to the north between the Bug and the Vistula. The picture that unrolled before our eyes was this. The Russian front in the southern half is stretched almost to breaking. Its northern half, held firmly on the northwest, has formed a mighty new flank in the south between the Vistula and the Pripyat marshes. If we now broke through from the north against the rear of the Russian main mass, all the Russian armies would be threatened with a catastrophe. The idea which had led to the winter battle presented itself once more, this time perhaps in yet broader outlines. The blow must now be delivered from East Prussia, first and most effectively from the Osowiecz Grodno line. Yet the marshes in that region prohibited our advance at that point. We knew that from the thaw in the previous winter. All that was left us was the choice between a breakthrough west or east of this line. A thrust right through the enemy defenses, I might say, into the very heart of the Russian army, demanded the direction past and east of Grodno. We put that view forward. Main headquarters did not shut their eyes to its advantages, but considered the western direction shorter and believed that a great success could be won on this side also. They therefore demanded an offensive across the upper Narew. I thought that it was my duty to withdraw my objections to this plan for the time being, for the sake of the whole operation, and in any case await the result of this attack and the further course of the operation. General Ludendorff, however, inwardly adhered to our first plan. But this difference of opinion had no kind of influence on our future thoughts and actions, and in no way diminished the energy with which, in the middle of July, we translated into action the decisions of main headquarters, the responsible authority. Galwitz's army surged out against the Nero on both sides of Przasnysz. For this attack I went personally to the battlefield, not with any idea of interfering with the tactics of the army headquarters staff, which I knew to be masterly, but only because I knew what outstanding importance main headquarters attached to the success of the breakthrough they had ordered at this point. I wanted to be on the spot, so that in case of need I could intervene immediately if the army headquarters staff needed any further help for the execution of its difficult task from the armies under my command. I spent 2 days with this army and witnessed the storming of Przasnysz, for the possession of which there had previously been violent and continuous fighting, and the battle for the district south of the town. By July 17th, Galwitz had reached the Narrow. Under the pressure of the Allied armies, breaking in on every side, the Russians gradually began to give way at all points and to withdraw slowly before the menace of envelopment. Our pursuit began to lose its force in incessant frontal actions. In this way we could not gather the fruits which had been sown time and time again on bloody battlefields. We therefore returned to our earlier idea, and having regard to the course the operations were taking, wished to press forward beyond Kovno and Vilna, with a view to forcing the Russian center against the Pripyat marshes and cutting their communications with the interior of the country. However, the views of main headquarters required a straightforward pursuit, a pursuit in which the pursuer gets more exhausted than the pursued. In this period fell the capture of Novo-Georgievsk. In spite of its situation as a strategic bridgehead, this fortress had certainly not seriously interfered with our movements hitherto. But its possession was of importance for us at this time, because it barred the railway to Warsaw from Lava. Just before the capitulation on August 18th, I met my emperor outside the fortress, and later on it was in his company that I drove into the town. The barracks and other military buildings, which had been set on fire by Russian troops, were still blazing. Masses of prisoners were standing round. One thing we noticed was that before the surrender, the Russians had shot their horses wholesale, obviously as a result of their conviction of the extraordinary importance which these animals had for our operations in the east. Our enemy always took the most enormous pains to destroy everything, especially supplies, which could be of the slightest use to his victorious foe. To clear the way for a later advance on Vilna, we sent our Niemen army out eastwards, as early as the middle of July. In the middle of August, Kovno fell under the blows of the 10th Army. The way to Vilna was open, but once again we were not strong enough to proceed with the execution of our great strategic idea. Our forces were employed as before in following up frontally. Weeks passed before reinforcements could be brought up. Meanwhile, the Russians were continuing their retirement to the east. They surrendered everything, even Warsaw, in the hope of at least being able to save their field armies from destruction. It was only on September 9th that we started out against Vilna. It was possible that even now great results could be obtained in this direction. A few 100,000 Russian troops might perhaps be our booty. If ever proud hopes were mingled with anxiety and impatience, they were mingled now. Should we be too late? Were we strong enough? Yet on we went past Vilna, then south. Our cavalry soon laid hands on the vital veins of the Russians. If we could only grasp them tightly, it would mean death to the main Russian armies. The enemy realized the disaster that was threatening and did everything to avert it. A murderous conflict began at Vilna. Every hour gained by the Russians meant that many of their units streaming eastwards were saved. The tide turned, and our cavalry division had to withdraw again. The railway into the heart of the country was open to the Russians once more. We had come too late and were now exhausted. I do not delude myself into thinking that the opposition between the views of main headquarters and our own will have an historical interest. Yet, in judging the plans of our high command, we must not lose sight of the whole military situation. We ourselves then saw only a part of the whole picture. The question whether we should have made other plans and acted otherwise, if we had known the whole political and military situation, must be left open.
3. Lotzen.
From these serious topics, let me turn to a more idyllic side of our lives in the year 1915, as I pass to my memories of Lotzen. This pretty little town, lying among lakes, forests, and hills, was our headquarters when the winter battle in Masuria was drawing to its close. The inhabitants, freed from the Russian danger and the Russian terror, gave us a touchingly warm reception. I have grateful memories, too, of pleasant visits to neighboring properties, which could be reached without too great loss of time when service claims permitted it, visits which brought us hours of relaxation, recreation, and good sport. There was also a certain amount of hunting. Our greatest triumph in this respect, thanks to the kindness of His Majesty, was the killing of a particularly fine elk in the royal shoot of Neumonian by the Kurish's half. In the spring, when activity on our front gradually began to die down, there was no lack of visitors of all kinds, and this was true of the summer also. German princes, politicians, scientists, and professional men, as well as commercial men and administrative officials, came to us, brought by the interest which the province of East Prussia, usually so little visited, had acquired in the course of the war. Artists presented themselves with a view to immortalizing General Ludendorff and myself with their brushes and chisels. But this was a distinction with which we would have preferred to dispense, in view of our scanty hours of leisure, although we much appreciated the kindness and skill of the gentleman in question. Neutral countries also sent us guests, among others Sven Hedin, the celebrated Asiatic explorer and convinced friend of Germany, whom I learnt to know and appreciate. Of the statesmen who came to see us at Lotzen, I must give a special mention to the then Imperial Chancellor, von Bethmann-Hollweg, and Grand Admiral von Tirpitz. Even while I was at Posen in the winter of 1914-15, I had had an opportunity of welcoming the Imperial Chancellor to my headquarters. His visit was inspired primarily by his personal kindness, and was not directly connected with any political questions. Nor do I remember that my conversation with the Imperial Chancellor touched on this subject at that time. In any case, I had the impression that I was dealing with a clever and conscientious man. At this time, our views about the military necessities of the moment coincided at all material points. Every word of the Chancellor's betrayed his deep sense of responsibility. I can understand that feeling, although from my soldier's point of view, I considered that in his judgment of the military situation, Herr von Bethmann showed too much anxiety and therefore too little confidence. The impression I had gained in Posen was confirmed at Lotzen. Grand Admiral von Tirpitz, who was often quoted as Bethmann-Hollweg's successor about this time, was a personality of a very different stamp. On a long walk that I took with him, he told me all the sorrows which vexed his flamingly patriotic, and in particular, seaman's heart. It was a bitter sorrow to him that the mighty weapon he had forged during the best years of his life should be shut up in its home harbors in time of war. It is true that the chances for a naval offensive on our side were uncommonly difficult, but, on the other hand, they did not improve with long waiting. In my opinion, the very great sensitiveness of the English to the phantom of a German invasion would have justified greater activity on the part of our fleet, and indeed, heavy sacrifices. I considered it possible that such a use of the fleet might have tied up strong English forces at home, and thereby relieved the burden of our army. It is said that the policy we pursued was intended to enable us to have a strong, intact German fleet whenever peace negotiations came in sight. A calculation of this kind would be absolutely erroneous, for a power which one dare not use in war is a negligible factor when it comes to the peace treaty. The desire of the Grand Admiral's heart was granted in the spring of 1916. Skagerrak gave brilliant proof of what our fleet could really do. Herr von Tirpitz also gave expression to his views about our U-boat operations. It was his opinion that we had begun to use this weapon at the wrong time, and then, frightened at the attitude of the President of the United States, lowered the arm which we had raised with such loud shouts of victory, likewise at the wrong time. The opinions the Grand Admiral then expressed could exercise no influence on the position I took up later with regard to this question. Almost another year and a half were to pass before the decision was to devolve on me. In that period, on the one hand, the military situation had materially changed to our disadvantage, and on the other hand, the efficiency of our Navy in the sphere of U-boat operations had more than doubled.
4. Kovno.
In October 1915, we transferred our headquarters to Kovno in the occupied territory. To the former activities of my Chief of Staff were now added the duties of administering, reorganizing, and exploiting the country with a view to procuring supplies for the troops, the homeland, and the local population. The increasing amount of work this involved would alone have been enough to take up the whole time and energies of one man. General Ludendorff regarded it as an appendix to his ordinary work, and devoted himself to it with that ruthless energy which is all his own. It was while I was at Kovno that in the more peaceful spells during the winter of 1915-16, I found time to visit the forest of Bialowieza. Unfortunately, the game had suffered severely from the effects of military operations. Troops marching through and poaching peasants had cleared a good deal of it. Nevertheless, in 4 days of splendid deer stalking and slaying in January 1916, I managed to bring down a bison and 4 stags. The administration of the great forest de Mesen was entrusted to the tried hands of the Bavarian Forstmeister Escherich, who was a past master in the art of making the splendid timber supplies available for us without thereby damaging the forest permanently. The same winter I paid a visit to the forest of Augustovo. Unfortunately, a wolf hunt which had been got up in my honor proved fruitless. The wolves seemed to have a preference for slipping away beyond range of my gun. The only traces of the Battle of February 1915 that I could see were some trenches. Apart from them, the battlefield had been completely cleared, at any rate, in those parts of the forest which I visited. In April 1916, I celebrated at Kovno the 50th anniversary of my entry into the service. With thanks in my heart to God and my Emperor and King, who glorified the day with a gracious message, I looked back on half a century which I had spent in war and peace, in the service of throne and fatherland. It was at Kovno that, in the summer of 1812, a large part of the French army had crossed the Niemen on its way east. Recollections of that epoch, and the tragic conclusion of that bold campaign, had inspired our enemies with the hope that in the vast areas of forest and marsh in the heart of Russia, our own armies would suffer the same fate through hunger, cold, and disease as had overtaken the proud armies of the great Corsican. This fate was prophesied for us by our enemies, perhaps less from inward conviction than with a view to tranquilizing uncritical opinion at home. It is true that our anxiety for the maintenance of our troops in the winter of 1915-16 was not small, for we knew that, in spite of all modern developments, we had to spend the worst season of the year in a relatively desolate part of the country, in many parts of which infectious diseases were rife.
This concludes today's reading of Out of My Life, by Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent chapter, or download the entire audiobook from our webshop at intonio.net. Thank you for listening, and so long.